So this was a long text today, the gospel lesson, and I think the interesting part of it is that idea that Nicodemus asks Jesus, how can you be born a second time? How can you go into your mother's womb and come out again? That seems a little ridiculous, right? That's kind of a ridiculous question. But at this time, this whole idea of being born a second time, that was a new concept for people. That wasn't something that they'd heard their whole lives. I mean, you and I, we've probably heard this idea our whole lives about being born this second time because perhaps we're lifelong churchgoers. Maybe if you didn't grow up going to church, you may not have heard this. However, the phrase born again is something that people have heard quite a bit, even if you haven't gone to church. So I did a scientific study that didn't really involve any science, just my Facebook page. And I put out there on Facebook, I asked the question, what does the phrase born again mean to you? And I got a lot of responses. There were probably about 30 people or so who responded to this question. Now, some people had very positive things to say about being born again. They identified themselves as being born again. They had maybe an experience, and they felt closer to God, or they felt this relationship to Jesus. And they talked freely about that. People kind of opened up and talked freely about that. And then I actually had more people say not positive things about the phrase born again. There were people who brought up being talked down to about how they weren't born again, and so they weren't going to go to heaven. I have a friend from junior high school who is Jewish, and she was probably one of the 2 Jewish people in our junior high school, her and her twin sister. And she said that somebody told her in junior high that she was going to go to hell, and that it was very sad that she was going to go to hell because she was Jewish. So these are things that people associate with the phrase born again. And I wonder, too, if it has been a little co-opted by a certain section of Christians to not necessarily lift themselves up into this idea of a relationship with Jesus, but to point the finger at others and say, well, you are not this. And if you are not this, then too bad for you. But I don't necessarily think as Lutherans, being in a Lutheran church here is really part of our theology. And why is that? Why is it that we feel this way? And I think a lot of it is, well, we get our ideas from this guy called Martin Luther. And guess what he said about this? It isn't necessarily that we have this one experience. It isn't necessarily that we are born again once or that we have been saved at one particular moment in our lives. But it is a continual dying and rising again with Jesus. And his way of connecting that was through our baptism, through the water and through the Spirit, which is exactly what Jesus says to Nicodemus in this passage. That to be part of this kingdom of God is to be born from above, not from below. To be born above, to be born through water and through Spirit, is going through our baptism. Now, a bunch of you raised your hands and said that you were baptized as babies, so you may not remember your baptism. But sometimes people are older, and they do remember their baptism, and perhaps it's a choice to be baptized. So that is a little different, isn't it? If you're older and you make this decision, it's a little more involved, isn't it? But is that exactly what it means? Because baptism is something that happens to us and creates this relationship and promise of God in our lives. So we are born again through our baptisms. We are born again through our relationship with God. We are born again over and over again. One thing that Martin Luther said about our baptism is that it is actually a garment that we put on every day. It's something that we wear and we bring with us through our whole lives. It's not this one moment that you are brought to this font or to the water. It's something that happens to us all the time. We are constantly being born again. But also something that I find interesting is that these are stories that we can tell. And if you notice, or if you've ever met anyone who's asked you if you've been saved or has a born-again story, they're very passionate about that. And really, you could be one of them. You might have a passionate story about your relationship with Christ. But as I have had discussions with a few Lutheran friends, I've heard more than once, "Oh, but we're Lutheran. We don't really talk about that kind of stuff. We're Lutheran. We don't have those kind of stories." Well, I think that's not right. I'm a crazy extrovert, so I talk all the time, which is not abnormal for me. So I do have a lot of crazy stories, but that's not because I'm a Lutheran. It's because I have that faith story inside me. So this morning, during the Sunday forum where all the adults get together and talk about different things on faith, we didn't have a ton of people show up. So about 4 or 5 of us sat down and we talked about, I said, "Well, what's your faith story?" And that's Jane Tobler. You guys know Jane Tobler? If you don't know her, she's amazing, so you need to meet Jane. But she said, "I've never thought about it. I've never thought about my faith story. I don't think I have a faith story." And I thought, "Jane, you have a story for everything." She does. Like, how do you not have a faith story? And she's like, "Well, I've just always come to church. I've just always done this. I've always been here." I'm like, "But that's your faith story. Just because you didn't have some sort of conversion or just because you didn't have a moment in which God came to you in a bolt of lightning, that doesn't mean you don't have a faith story. Because why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you sitting in this pew right now? Or why are you in the choir? Or why are you acolyting? Why are you here? You're here because you have a faith story. And maybe that faith story is that a faithful person in your life brought you to church every day when you were a child. That's my faith story. My mom brought me to church. I was 8 years old when I started going to church. And I went every day with my mom. That was my faith story. It's not a bolt of lightning. Some people are like, "Why do you want to be a pastor when you grow up?" Usually I tell them it's for the money, but the second thing I tell them is because, at one point in my life, something happened to me, and I said, "You know what? I love this. I love God's people, and I love this story, and I want to tell the story." That doesn't make my faith story any special. I don't have a special moment. But it's that sharing of these stories that we come to learn about the family of God, about our trip to the font, about the way we can communicate with each other that shows God's love. And, let's admit it, our church is, this church is actually growing, so I can't say our church isn't growing, but our whole Lutheran church is not growing. Why is that? Is it because we're sitting back and we're like, "Oh, we're Lutheran. We don't evangelize. We're not Lutheran. We're Lutheran. We don't go on the street corners and talk about Jesus. That's not us. That's not us." Well, I'm not telling you to get out on a milk crate with a bullhorn and start telling everybody that they're saved. But why are we not telling our stories? Now, I don't know if he's here today. Poor Brian Anderson. If he's like, "Oh no, I'm getting called out." But if you've met Brian Anderson, he's a new member to the church here, and he just moved to DC not that long ago, and he bought like a couch or something on Craigslist. And the guy who he picked the couch up from invited him to church and said, "Hey, would you like to come to church?" It wasn't this church. It was a different church. And he actually started going there for a while and realized that church wasn't really for him. He grew up Lutheran. So he got on Google and found his local Lutheran church, and it happened to be this one. He shows up, and, well, he's not here today, but hopefully you're not listening to this sermon on the internet later, Brian, and I'm not calling you out. But it's, that was the thing. He shows up and gets involved, and this is where his home is. But Google showed him this church. Google is doing our evangelism. Why are we not doing it? Why are we not sharing our stories and showing that love of God for one another? Now, not everybody's doing it. I'm sure there are times, you guys are probably like, Vicar Katie, I share my story all the time. Yes, it does happen. It does. And this is encouraging. Because when we share our stories, when we are talking about our baptism, when we are sharing the love of God, and sometimes those stories don't even involve the words God, Christ, church. Sometimes those stories don't involve words at all. What did St. Francis say? Preach the gospel at all times and sometimes use words. And I think we can do that. So my challenge to you and to myself is tell your story. Maybe make that part of your Lent discipline. Don't give it up for Lent. Add something to Lent. Add your story. Tell your story. Maybe tell it to somebody you live with. It could be your spouse. It could be your kids. Do your children even know about your faith? Why are you here? It's not because everybody else is doing it. This is not a fad or a trend or something popular. Why are you here? I can't answer that for you. You have to answer that yourself. So that is your challenge today, this week, this month, this season of Lent. What is your story, and how can you share it? Amen.